All right, well, we're excited to have Dr. Josh Bailey to teach us about research related to barefoot running. So let's give him an applause.
Sorry, thanks. Can you guys hear me fine, or do I need to turn the microphone on in here? Can you guys back there hear me good? Okay, so I won't turn this one on, but so thanks for having me. This is exciting stuff for me. So I've been doing running research throughout my master's and my doctorate degree, and now I'm starting to bring it here at the university as well. It's really my passion is endurance running. And when people hear that I do endurance running and where I come from, the first thing they ask me is about footwear and shoes and whether I should go barefoot or not. And as you can look at my feet, I'll throw the couple biases out about myself right away. I am a minimalist runner, okay? I did have knee pain when I used to run in traditional shod shoes. And I'm going to explain some of these terms as we go forward, which means I was a very hardcore heel striker, and I had a long stride pattern. So how many of you guys would classify yourself as an endurance runner, or that you've run a race? Has anybody run an endurance race? A couple of you? Okay. Would you classify yourself as an endurance runner? Currently or in the past? Yes? Cool. How many of you know anything about running? Okay. How many of you know stuff about walking? How many of you have heard about this minimalist and barefoot craze? How many have a stance on it? You think it's good or bad? So I want to start there before we get into a presentation. He went in the back like this. I asked if it's good, and he went like this. What do you mean by this?
I mean, at a certain point, yes, it would be beneficial for you to run without anything on your feet, but at the same time, it could also protect your feet from foreign objects or anything else that can damage your body slowly, periodically throughout your running time.
So what I hear you saying is there's benefit, but there's also things that we have to be cautious about. Yeah? All right. So we're going to get into some conversation, and the way I like to do this is I made a PowerPoint presentation because I think we need to have some structure and organization to I do for my train of thought. But if you've had me for class, I see Blake, then you know I go on tangents and I go off topic a little bit. So if you guys come up to a point where you see something you really want to talk about, let's dive that way. Let's go down that rabbit hole, because that's what I love to do. Okay? But so we'll get started. And the title of my presentation, what I really put it as was, do you individually run the way you were intended to? And that word intended, I should have made that really capitalized, highlighted, italicized in a different font, because that's really where this concept of barefoot and minimalist derived from people who are in a department on campus called evolutionary biology, right? That is where this whole craze has really taken off over the last few years. All right, so we'll get into that in a minute. But these are all different statements that you've probably heard somebody talk about, right? So the first one here is, oh, you have great running form. What is running form to you? And if somebody said that to you, think about in your mind what that means. Because I have a debate with people a lot. I forgot to tell you another bias of mine, is I've been a personal trainer and a strength coach before. So that's another bias that I have coming to this, right? So I think of a certain aspect of what we do is for our bodies and how we prepare. But I also think we can do things correctively without equipment to change the way we move, which may be better for our bodies than actual equipment like orthotics or special footwear. So that's my other bias going into this, okay? So the idea with you have great running form. Do you think there's one running form for everybody? Do you think we all have one way to run? I see a couple of shakings of the heads. What is that? Why not? Why do you say no? Anybody? The guy next to you was shaking his head, not you, but.
Because everyone's different.
Because everybody's different. How are we different?
Like some are tall, some are short.
So anatomically, we're different. Height, stature. But what else is different about us? How many of you have been injured in the last 2 years? So you are now structurally different. you are now mechanically and physiologically different in your bodies, right? So there's changes and adaptations that have occurred. And that's really what we're going to talk about a little bit too. But then you say, you run very efficiently. And the way I run efficiently may be different than the way you run efficiently. And so for me to manipulate your gait mechanics by manipulating footwear or not may be different. I will tell you, when I started my graduate degree, I had run at that point 5 marathons, 3 of which were in minimalist shoes. And I was like, the whole world needs to be in minimalist shoes. It's the best thing for everybody. And so my master's advisor and I, we had a lot of debates. And quickly I said, well, you know, minimalists and barefoot running are good for some people, but not everybody. And it's the way we transition that is very important. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. But this is the key component right here. And this is where we have made a multi-million-dollar industry out of footwear, and really where some of the research is leading towards minimalist and barefoot running. But I hope to poke some gaps in there. And I didn't put a lot of research in this because I want to have more discussion and a lot about, because when we start talking about barefoot running and minimalist running, there's people like me that feel it's a good thing to do. And then there's a camp that says, no, the evidence doesn't support it. But their evidence, we can talk about shod running and foot strike stuff, doesn't support their stance a lot either. And I'll show you where that comes from. But then it's this. And this leads us into the barefoot minimalist topic. In order for you to reduce injuries, you need to change something. Because if you are getting injured, there is something either mechanically incorrect about your form or your running pattern, or you're just doing it too much. A colleague of mine that I got my doctorate with, he's a sprinter. He's an anaerobic person, right? And we used to debate all the time, and his idea was, well, you just shouldn't run long distances. You're going to get injured. Everybody's going to get injured if you run long distances, right? Which is not truly correct, but it's also what we classify an injury as, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Everybody follow me so far? Have you guys all heard these statements before? For the runners, you've probably definitely heard these before, right? And if you have a coach, you've heard these definitely, because they're trying to change something about the way you run, which is not necessarily a good thing. So this is how I do my research, right? And so these are individual runners, and I'll tell you a story about this guy. This is, if anybody knows who Dean Karnazes is, that's Dean Karnazes. So Dean Karnazes is a gentleman who will run a marathon to the start of a marathon to run the marathon, right? This is a guy who spent 24 hours suspended above Times Square on a treadmill to run on a treadmill for 24 hours and had to go to the bathroom on that suspended treadmill and pull up curtains around him because helicopters were taking pictures of him while he was going to the bathroom on top of this treadmill. This guy is insane. But if you look at his pattern, and I'll tell you, he always has footwear on. This is somebody that is running on a treadmill, and you really can't see it, but this is a 4-foot striker, and you'll know what 4-foot striking is in a second. But each one of these individuals runs differently. Dean is what we call a mechanically sound runner for himself. Now, if you ask him, and you ask some of the people who've done research for him for a long period of time, he's mechanically perfect. He has biomechanical perfect form. Now, I don't know what that means. And I tried to talk to him about it, and he doesn't know what it means. He's just been told that. But he's also supposed to be physiological perfect, too. All right. So running. Who can define running for me? Who has their own? I put a term up here, and this is how I defined it. But who has a definition of what running is? Anybody? What's walking? So they're both modes of locomotion. Yeah? Can we agree on that? They're the two modes of locomotion that we do. Walking, there is 2 phases to it. There's single support and double support. In running, that double support is replaced by an aerial phase where you become a projectile motion. And then this is where it becomes very important to us. And this is where the research over the last 4 decades is really focused, is what happens when we interact the ground with that leg. And many people call running a series of single-legged hops or jumps because you land on one leg, okay? The higher you go, the harder you're supposed to come down to the ground. And this is the interaction that we're going to talk about here in a second. So running, short term. Single support followed by an aerial phase. That means no foot is in contact with, 0 feet in contact with the ground. Foot, left, right, left. Okay? Everybody good? So this is what it looks like. We have walking and running, right? Just a nice stick model of what they look like so we can all be on the same page of what we're going. I'm going to define a few things here quickly. All right? After this. Who's read Born to Run? Anybody? Okay. So Born to Run is a book that Chris McDougall authored last decade that discusses and follows a gentleman by the name, his nickname is Caballo Blanco, so the white horse. And he's a gentleman who is an ultra endurance runner and would go down to this city in Mexico, Chihuahua, quite often and run with the local tribe. And they were a mountain tribe called the Tarahumara. And this group, in this book, spiraled the minimalist and barefoot running world. And I'll tell you, it's this book alone that got me to transition from rear foot striking, overstriding, shod running, to minimalist running. And it changed my life without surgery, which is great. But so this is him right here. This is Caballo Blanco. He actually died in 2012 out for a run I don't remember, I think it was in Colorado. But he didn't come back from his long run, and so they sent out a search party, and he just had a heart attack and passed away during his middle of his run. These are some of the groups that are running. But if you look on the feet, this is what started it all. This tribe typically runs, now I say started all, but started the frenzy for it to come back, because it had always been there. But it came back with a vengeance during this time. Late 2000s, early 2010 area. But this footwear is just a sandal. And it's just a piece of rubber that's strapped to the foot. And so through this following and talking to Caballo Blanco, they started doing this work with another group. And the other group is Dan Lieberman. And Dan Lieberman is a huge evolutionary biologist from Harvard. So right away, he has great esteem. But what happened with him is he went down to Kenya. And I'm going to play this for you because I think you need to hear it from his mouth. Let's see if I can open this up. Forgot to do this ahead of time. Okay, so I just wanted to hear Dan Lieberman talk about this, just so you can get a basis of what we're talking about.
I've been a runner all my life, and I've run with shoes pretty much all that time. But as a result of this research, I thought I should try barefoot running. And I actually have to say, I've really enjoyed it. It's been a lot of fun. Humans have been running for at least 2 million years. And of course, for most of that time, humans were running barefoot. And modern running shoes were actually only invented in the mid-1970s. So we have this idea now that, in order to run, all you need are a pair of shoes. It's a common statement, right? Well, actually, that's not true. You don't need shoes. You just need feet. There's probably 2 stages in the evolution of the foot. Initially, the foot evolved for walking and also to climb trees. But at some point in human evolution, we think around 2 million years ago, there was a big environmental change in Africa, and the woodlands started disappearing and the savannas started growing. And at that point, new foods started appearing, and one of them, of course, was meat. There were all these ungulates out there on the grasslands. And in order to become a hunter, I think humans started to evolve running. And what we're good at is running at speeds that make animals gallop. And if you do that in the heat for a long period of time, that animal will overheat because quadrupeds cannot pant and gallop at the same time. So imagine you're chasing a gazelle or a kudu or some big animal. If you can chase that animal, make that animal gallop for 10 to 15 minutes, you've got dinner. We wanted to figure out how people ran without shoes before the shoe was invented, because people have been running for millions of years. And we weren't really sure what happens when barefoot runners run and how well they can do it. So we started bringing in habitual barefoot runners into the lab to see how they use their bodies and how they use their feet.
All right, here we go. 3, 2, 1.
What we discovered was that barefoot runners run often very differently from the way your typical shod runner runs. So the shoe has got a big heel and it's designed to make it very comfortable to land on your heel, and so a lot of shod runners land on the heel, right? And then they bring the rest of their foot down. So when you land again on your heel, your body comes to a dead stop. There's a lot of mass, and so there's an impact. There's a rapid force. It's like somebody hitting you on the heel with a hammer, about 2 to 3 times your body weight. So when we started bringing barefoot runners into the lab, we discovered that they didn't like to do that, right? They typically landed on the front of their foot, pretty horizontally, not like that, but just a little bit, so that they land underneath the heads of the 4th and 5th metatarsal often, and then they bring the heel down. And when we ran them over force plates, we discovered that they didn't have that big spike, that impact transient that is typically associated with a heel strike. So what barefoot runners tend to do is by landing more towards the front of the foot and then letting the heel come down afterwards. And what that does is it converts the energy that would otherwise be a dead stop, right? A vertical deceleration of the leg. It converts that into rotational energy.
You can understand the difference with the following very commonplace observation. Imagine dropping the pen onto the ground, but falling vertically down. That's like your heel strike, where your entire leg strikes the ground and comes to stop, and it's a big impact force. On the other hand, if you're a 4-foot striker, then you can think of it like the pen landing at an oblique angle, where it hits the ground and it doesn't come to a dead stop but starts rotating. So not all the energy, kinetic energy of the pen has to be absorbed by the impact. Some of it gets just transferred from moving down to rotation, and so the impact forces are much smaller in a 4-foot strike compared to a heel strike.
A lot of runners get injured, and what they get typically often are repetitive stress injuries. And so one hypothesis is that that impact caused by landing on the heel, which causes that big impact transient, could be injurious, and it's associated with pain in the soft tissues at the bottom of the foot. It's associated with shin splints, may cause some other kinds of injury. So our hypothesis is that individuals who don't land on their heel but avoid those big impacts by landing on the front of their foot may be less susceptible to those kinds of repetitive stress injuries.
So I want to stop it there because I want to point something out, and then we'll get back to the presentation. So if you look at this, and one of the ideas with these videos that Dan Lieberman in his group, Irene Davis is one of them now as well, Irene Davis is huge in the footwear industry, or in running in research, and she's at the Harvard Spalding lab. But if you look at these two runners, they're a different runner. They're not the same runner, right? And so part of their idea is that if we find people who were, and this is back, I think they did it back in 15, 20 years ago, the first time they went to Kenya, they found this group that when they were barefoot, they all 4-foot stroke, or were striking the ground with bare feet. But when they put shoes on people, they went right to a rear foot. And they had a small sample size. So I don't know how many of you have taken stats and all that, but we have that small sample size, we're a little hesitant. But in my world, we like small sample sizes. So what did you guys take away from that video? Anything? Did you notice anything about the way he was talking about the concepts and his hypotheses? What was he talking about really? What did it all come down to? Did he mention anything about there being a surface between the foot and the ground? It was all about how people were striking the ground, right? Their foot strike pattern. Some people were striking with their forefoot and some with the heel foot, and they're relating it to footwear. But now we're going to talk about a little further about, does that supported by the science? Is it simply the footwear, or is there something else to it? Okay? So this is what he was talking about. We evolved to create a running pattern that we could run at speeds that cause these animals to gallop. And one thing he was saying was that animals, quadrupeds, when they're hunting them back in the day, if they got to the gallop, then they wouldn't be able to pant, therefore they overheated and had to stop, and eventually you could catch up to them. So if you ran for 15 minutes at a certain velocity, then you could catch and hunt your prey. But those guys were doing it barefoot, or did they have a little bit of padding like the Tarahumara down in Mexico when they go out and run? We don't truly know yet. But here are our basic ideas that we need to define. Barefoot, shod, minimalist, and then barefoot running, right? So barefoot just means you don't have that protective covering on the bottom. That is true barefoot running. There's nothing there. Shod, and this is just traditional footwear. So it could be maximalist. It could be just a non-neutral shoe. It could be a race flat. Anytime you have a normal traditional shoe on your foot, it's called shod running. Vibrams are truly shod running, because what we know from research nowadays is if you put minimalist shoes on somebody, they tend to run just like they did with normal footwear. Okay? But then you have the minimalist, and the classification depends on who you talk to, but generally it's less than 4 millimeters from a heel to the toe drop. Heel toe means the difference from the padding, from where my heel pad is to where my forefoot pad is. And if that is less than 4 millimeters, we classify that, most people do, as a heel toe drop. It doesn't matter how much padding or outsole there is. I just bought a new pair of Ultras that are about that thick on the outside, but they have a 0 drop. So they're called minimalist shoes. Okay? These are the foot strike patterns we're going to talk about. Forefoot, midfoot, and rear foot. And these are very important to keep in mind because they go back and forth in how we classify things. Some people use a strike index. And if you'll notice the angle here, you'll see some images in a minute that have that rear foot very exaggerated. It's a strike like this, which is very detrimental. This one, not so much, depending on where their midline is or where their center of mass is, okay? But this is also how it's depicted. And one of the things you heard Dan Lieberman talk about was impacts, right? And loading. How many of you have taken physics? Did you guys talk about ground reaction forces at all? Forces? Yeah, kinetics? So that's what these are right here. This is the vertical component of a ground reaction force. And simply put, the ground is going to push back on me the same as I push on it. Simply put. And this is the vertical component, so the component that goes directly back up my structure. And the theory behind this is that heel-toe running, or if I strike my heel first, a greater amount of that load is going to go directly back up through my joints. Okay? If I hit with my forefoot, I add another joint, and the center of pressure is not in line with that kinetic chain going directly up my loaded structure. Okay? So it's a little bit aligned. So I take away and alleviate some of that vertical ground reaction force via the moments going back up my system. But if you look at this, it's very interesting to me that they actually, in this image, they use different footwear to correspond with a different foot strike. What Dan Lieberman was talking about is barefoot runners typically go to more of a forefoot. Now the true forefoot, though, that's also an exaggeration. It looks more like this. And you saw that in those videos. There's a little roll from the fourth and fifth down to your heel. I had one runner in my recent study I'm doing right now who her heel never touches the ground, even with footwear, even in shod condition. Okay? And this is what it looks like, the different foot strikes with the same footwear. Okay? So I hope when, at the end of this, the idea, and you see up here, should I barefoot? It's really how should I run? Because we're going to talk about barefoot running is not really the concept of barefoot. It's a concept of how I feel in the environment, and it's going to be interest, okay? All right. Everybody recognize this up here? That's a shoe store, right? This is where we're going with the footwear industry. This is why people like me are hesitant in the footwear industry, because like this, we're trying to use mechanical devices to assist us in our movement patterns. And that's why people like me believe minimalist or barefoot running allows us to use our body to do our movement. This has springs inside of it. And the concept is if I compress those springs, it doesn't help me move. But what does that do to your structure? That's going to weaken your structure, theoretically, because you're not using your structure and the loading of your structure to locomote and move in your environment. Okay? This right here is how they identify what kind of footwear you should be. And that is a static stance on a platform barefoot. Okay? So you do this barefoot, and they determine what kind of footwear to put you in. So this is where this challenge comes into play for me, right? The idea of being a barefoot runner or being measured barefoot and putting a shoe on my foot, they don't add up. Because it's running static. Are you stationary when you run? No? What do we call it? What kind of movement is it? It's dynamic. It's a dynamic motion. So if you think back to the Lieberman video, you saw these images of feet that turned red, green, yellow. And there was a line. And that's how your body changes its interaction with the ground at the foot. So if I'm loading my foot differently, I'm also loading the shoe differently. And that's where people like Dan Lieberman think that running barefoot allows you to manipulate just your own system and your foot in the environment properly, without putting some lever or some added padding underneath, which takes away some of the proprioception. So the top of this class has holistic in it, right? So for me, the idea of barefoot running is I want to feel my environment. And when I think of holistic, I think that is truly what barefoot running is all about, regardless of what the hard science says. Because I'm going to show you hard science that doesn't support it. But it's how we do the studies, okay? You guys ready? This is just how we classify shoes. We'll get past that. Again, continuum of shoes, arches, and what they put you in. How many of you have gone to a store and they've put you in a particular shoe because they watched you walk? Anybody here? Yeah? Did you try the shoe on, and how was it?
Are you saying how to walk with the shoe on?
Yep.
I used to actually really enjoyed it the time I had it.
Perfect. And it was a walking shoe or a running shoe? Running shoe? And did you run or walk in it when they tested you?
I ran.
Okay. Cool. Happens very frequently that you go to a store, they measure you and put you in a shoe. Very rarely are they going to tell you to run barefoot. Why? Dan Lieberman started his thing by it, right? Because they're not going to get money. Multi-billion-dollar industry, okay? But also, what this industry hasn't done in 4 decades of research, reduce injury rates. That's where barefoot running and minimalists came into play, to reduce injury rates. Just a little, going back, orthotics. This is that center of pressure concept with a forefoot, midfoot, and rear foot strike that you saw in Dan Lieberman's study. So these are the 3 components that barefoot running come into play, right? We want to reduce injury rate. Because if we strike the ground differently with a forefoot, we allow the foot, the metatarsals, the ligaments, the arches of the foot, as well as the ankle, to reduce some of the vertical stress that's going up to the system. That's one theory. Also, to enhance running efficiency. And that comes from, back in the old days, footwear was heavy. So we add mass to the end of our limbs, it increases the amount of energy we are required to move that limb through a range of motion. So that's where the oxygen consumption piece comes in. And we want to improve performance. Improved performance means some gait measures, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But here is your injury rate, depending on how you classify injury and the level of training you're at. If you're training for a marathon, you're up to the 74, some say 79%. If you're doing just general running, you're down to the 19s, or if they have the classification for injury higher. Okay? And injury is this. We talk about overuse injuries. It's not an acute injury. It's not stepping off a curb and twisting an ankle. Injury for us are patellofemoral pain, iliotibial stress syndrome, shin splints, any other kind of splint, piriformis syndrome of the hip. Okay, these are all different aspects that we talk about when we talk about overuse injuries in running. And what we say is the non-injury zones down here, when you do the frequency nice, not too much, or the stress level is not too high. So if I have a high impact, I don't have to have a lot of times that happening to get a high injury rate. If I run endurance-wise, typically my load is lower, but my frequency of impact is higher. So therefore I hit that injury zone. The idea with barefoot running and minimalist running is this. A couple mechanics change, so my impact decreases, but we'll show you how your frequency increases. So do they match out? And where do you go on this continuum? Okay? Again, a depiction of the ground reaction force is what we're really talking about when we go barefoot versus shod. The interesting part is, see the exaggeration now with these heel foot strikers? What you see here is a trough. So this first peak is from my limb, my leg hitting the ground. That's that first peak. Okay? It's an effective mass. It's the mass of my limb. The big peak is the loading of my center of mass. Okay? So force equals mass times acceleration. The acceleration is whatever the mass is accelerating at. Okay? You miss it here in the forefoot because what happens with forefoot striking that's not happening with heel foot striking? Does anybody know? You tend to strike the ground more underneath your body center of mass or your midline. So therefore, your body has already loaded the structure. Therefore, you don't have that impact. We call this an impact peak. This is the active peak. The loading rate they're talking about is the slope of this line here. Okay? The slope of where you're going to the top, that first. If you have a steeper slope, that means you're loading your structure fast. So if I go back to this, the stress level is a steeper slope. So if I'm up here, it takes me less times to experience that load before I get injury. Does that make sense? Cool? All right. This is what it looks like again. Now, I think what I really wanted to show with this slide is that you can have the exact same pattern of movement in ground reaction force, shod or barefoot. But what do you notice the same thing about these two images? Because it's the exact same runner. They're both forefoot striking. Okay? Exact same body weight, exact same pattern. One's with footwear, one's without footwear. Okay? So you should start to see a little pattern here. So this is some of Lieberman's research, because what Lieberman also did was they went back to Kenya, and they found people who were habitually shod or habitually barefoot running. But then they also people who rear foot stroke when they were barefoot, but also forefoot stroke when they were barefoot. And what you'll see is these plots, the rear foot striking barefoot group and the rear foot shod were very similar, except for down here. With this right here is the mean rate of loading. So the rate of loading is from this part, which is when he first hit, to that peak, what was the rate? And the rear foot shod was lower. And if we go back to this, that's because this trough was lower and the foot stopped quicker. Because this is acceleration. And what happens when I put shoes underneath my foot during the impact with the ground? Versus just striking the ground with my own body. Can somebody explain why they think this would be steeper than that? Everybody know what acceleration is? Who's taking physics? Where's my physics people? What's acceleration? Rate of change of velocity. So how quickly you change velocity. why would the individuals with footwear change their velocity over a longer period of time?
That's where it takes some velocity, so you that. So the distance that you're taking the velocity over is greater, and that's where you see it more time.
Okay, so you're saying the distance, but also what about the distance and how do you expand the time? Because the material properties of the footwear, right? I think that's where you're going.
Yeah, the velocity.
Yes, right? So the cushioning aspect of the footwear, first the shoe hits, and that's where you see that spike, but your foot is still traveling within the footwear, right? So that's why it's taking a little time. So that's why when you look at footwear and shod running, if it's a heel first run, the heel is where all the support is, where all the cushioning is, because they want you to absorb some of those impacts. So we go forward. That's what's going on here. That's why the rear foot striking barefoot had such a high impact. The struggle was with, if you go back and look at this paper, is how they were striking the ground. And they were striking the ground still out in front of their body with an obvious forefoot strike. Okay? Because a lot of times now what we see is people become more habitual with things. They tend to strike more under the ground with more of a flatter foot. Okay? So these are the benefits that we've seen in a couple review papers that have come out to do the summation of the literature, right? So decreased stride length, increased frequency is truly where we see all this benefit. Because if I increase my stride frequency and I decrease my stride length, what happens with that aerial phase? Does everybody know what stride frequency is? How many steps or strides per minute I take. So a stride is right leg to right leg. So if I increase how many strides I take per minute, what is that going to do to the amount of time I spend in the air between each stride? Decreases it. Did you guys cover projectile motion in physics? So if I'm in the air shorter period of time, what do I know about my vertical velocity coming down? Decreases. And if my vertical velocity decreases, what therefore should decrease about my vertical force? Should also decrease. So one of the benefits and what you hear people talk about when they talk about barefoot running is you should increase your frequency and decrease your stride length. So the question is, if you do that with footwear, does the same thing happen? Right? So if I just ran with a higher frequency and a decreased stride length, do I get the same benefits with the absorptive benefits of footwear? Also, decreased range of motion at the ankle, knee, and hip. Well, where does that come from? That comes from the decreasing of the stride length. Because range of motion is just how far of a degrees you go through over a period of time. From cycle, from foot contact to foot contact. So if I'm going through a greater range of motion, then I'm stepping out further and I'm making a bigger stride versus a smaller range. Okay? Maybe I come up here. Does everybody know what plantar flex is? Dorsiflex, plantar flex, right? So it makes sense if I'm transitioning to barefoot and they're telling me I need to run in a particular fashion that I'm going to become more plantar flexed. Because that's the style of running they want me to do. We've also seen from literature that just because I put you in minimalist shoes or tell you to go and train barefoot, you're not automatically going to go to a rear foot striking. Okay? This is the big one, impact force reduction. But I'll tell you right now that I'm one that refuses to believe that impacts cause injury. I come from a camp that believes it's how my body interacts with the ground, not necessarily how that ground reaction force comes up. Because I can manipulate the way I move in response to that, and then it matters on the workload and how I'm feeling. Because if I'm fatigued and I have that same experience with the ground, I'm probably going to get injured. But if I'm not fatigued and I have that same experience with the ground, I'm doing good, right? So I'll tell you, Alan Hurljack and his group really is opposed to this idea. And I argue with my colleagues quite a bit about this, about impact forces. I would say it's a summation of force, and there's some evidence to show that. with the workload that you experience and not necessarily just how you impact the ground, okay? And there's also evidence to show that we're pretty variable. I do variability research, that's what I'm focused on. But we can change our impacts with the ground constantly. And then we have the economy piece. We already talked about this concept of, this comes from back in the 80s and 90s. They were doing, back then the shoes were a lot heavier. And why were the shoes heavier? It's the materials they were using. We become, thanks to mechanical engineering, we're becoming really good with the type of equipment we use or materials we use in our shoes nowadays. So they become really, really light. Anybody seen Hokas? So if you look at a Hoka, they're really thick, right? Enormous amount of cushion. Anybody seen MBTs? They're a walking shoe that was established in the early 2000s. Those things are extremely heavy. Or the Skechers rocker bottom shoes, extremely heavy, right? Hoka is only 8.2 ounces. That's lighter than some of your traditional shod shoes at this point. But if we only have a 4.7 higher percent cost of ml per kg per minute of oxygen cost, and it's at 700 grams, which is 24.7 ounces, is that 8.2 going to do anything? And I will tell you, we found at UNLV that it doesn't. So if we put you into Hokas, your oxygen consumption doesn't increase. It stays the same, okay? Regardless of if you're running in an incline or running downhill or running at a level surface. So it's pretty killer, which is great because my advisor is a huge Hoka person. I can't run in those. But here's the big one. And from this holistic world and the mindset is people love the proprioception of the feet to feel the environment. I wear my Vibrams when hiking, I wear them running, and I wear them walking. I love to feel what's going on with me. It takes you a while to get used to it, but that's the number one reason why we do it. Because you want to be one with your environment. That's why Dan Lieberman, that's why all the barefoot running people do this. Not necessarily because of science, but because that's what we're intended to do. Not me, I'm not intended to. I just love to be able to feel it. And I love my feet nice and wide. What else happens with footwear? Your feet go like this, right? I like to feel it out. That's the other thing. What we've seen in a laboratory setting is that this reduction in running-related injuries doesn't correspond to changes in gait mechanics that we relate to those. And that is tibial rotation, okay? That is your eversion, inversion of the foot during foot strike, and that coupling of tibial rotation and eversion, inversion of the foot. So we see when people transition to a barefoot or minimalist style running, they don't elicit those styles of running that are dangerous or reduce those styles of running if they already had them in their footwear. And that's a very key component, because if you believe that the impacts and the way we do that and interact with that impact leads to endurance running injuries, and I put you in barefoot or minimalist shoes and you don't see a reduction in that, then my hypothesis is gone. So my reason for a minimalist of forefoot style running is gone. And that's where Joe Hamill and his group is coming in and saying, yeah, this is not what we should be doing. Because there's some studies that have come out that show that people who transition to barefoot running, especially Vibrams, still have injury. This is a group out of BYU run by Dr. Ridge and herself. And back when the transition to minimalist running really got popular, Vibram's marketing group had put on their website a method to transition. And the idea of transitioning from what you do on a daily basis to shod to minimalist should be a very long period of time because your system has to get used to it. So what they did is they took MRIs and they rated how much degradation and bone marrow edema happened in these visual images. And they found that as people transitioned to barefoot running, they had injuries. Now this is the key part, because these runners were still running. They didn't see the injury. So is it really an injury? Or is it an adaptation that comes from loading the structure? Because what we know about loading the structure is it has to break down to do what? To build back up. The whole concept with strength and conditioning is to overload your system to build it down so it rebuilds. So they did a 10-week intervention and 10-week study. And during this period of time, they found that a number of their athletes had different injuries. So the one on the right, the 1S, 2S, those are the number of subjects out of, I want to say it was only 15. It wasn't a lot of subjects. I can't remember the exact number. How many of those actually qualified as being injured? And then it has how many bones were in that individual section. Now, MES4, that's a level of bone marrow edema that is really like, okay, now you're getting injured. You shouldn't be running. That person was still running, by the way. Okay? But if you look down here, we break up the Vibram group, because this was our control group, into two things. The transition was every week you need to increase your mileage in the Vibrams 1 to 2 miles per week. But if you look at the difference, both of the amount of coverage in Vibrams was the same. What changed was their total mileage per week. So what could we conclude about this? Because this study alone cost Vibram multi-million dollars in a lawsuit. And it changed a lot of things about the industry and a lot of the beliefs about the industry. But it's because it could be related to just a change in workload. Because the injured group had a greater workload than the non-injured group. So they may not have recovered in time. The other idea is that 10 weeks are still in that breakdown and not build-up phase yet. You guys follow that? Does that make sense? So these are some of the disadvantages. And truly, there's nothing really disadvantageous about it from a mechanical standpoint. The idea is I come from Vegas. During the summertime, you don't want to run out barefoot. You're going to burn your feet. Okay? Also in Vegas, it's not the cleanest environment. So you have a lot of broken glass and things on the street that you don't want to get, even if you're going out in the trails. So you don't want to do that because you're going to hurt yourself. This loss of protective sensation is because you don't have that protective cover underneath the bottom of your foot. And this increased shock at impact, this is the only mechanical part where it's that loading rate. The shock is how much and how quickly that ground reaction force goes to your system. But I will tell you, you can manipulate through your ground reaction force how you strike the ground. And I showed you that in a few of the slides already. If I strike the ground with a more subtle foot strike, even barefoot running, I can reduce that impact and that loading rate going up. Okay? And we've seen that happen in multiple studies. This is when Dan Lieberman decided back in 2015 to go back out to Kenya. And what this is a series of runners. So each one of these lines, vertical lines, represents one runner with multiple trials. On the left-hand side is the way that they classify foot strike by angle. Forefoot up here, rear foot down here. Then you have what they're classified as, habitually barefoot, 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 and then you have your shod guys. If you notice, each of those groups strike in both categories. There's a barefoot and a minimalist category. Sorry, a rear foot and a forefoot in both of them. So being barefoot or being shod doesn't determine how you strike the ground. Doesn't describe your interaction with the vertical ground reaction force at the ground either. Okay? Does that make sense? You guys good? Any questions? Is this too much mechanics for you? You good with it? All right. So we'll go past this. So this is another study, and these are responders and non-responders. They had people transition. And this is the challenge you're going to find with the research, and this is the argument with the research currently, is I will bring all of you into the lab because you all pretty much, anybody here run minimalist? No? So I would bring you in the lab, and I would give you a pair of minimalist shoes, and I'd have you do the exact same thing you did with your shod shoes. And I would say any changes are what I would see if I gave you those shod shoes and had you run for 6 months and came back. So we're measuring acute changes, not adaptation to the system. And so the idea now, and Irene Davis and Dan Lieberman are actually doing this, they have a series of runners now coming in, and they're going through a series in a lengthy period of transition. Because even the transition studies we've done are short-term, 4, 6, 10, 12 weeks. It's still a short-term intervention for what we want to do for a chronic adaptation. So we see people that are both responders, positive and negative. And this is the other challenge with this industry and this line of research is these are just group means, right? So the way we do our statistical analysis is we average all of us individual runners into a mean, and we have our standard deviations, but that mean, none of us probably behave that way. So does it truly represent what's going on in our environment and our system? That's the other question in debate in our world right now. So this right here is a runner that just came in my study, actually, last night. And it's going to be hard to see, but I want you, this guy is a former track athlete who runs in race flats. So these are race flats, okay? So it's the closest you can get to a minimalist in traditional shod footwear. There's really there's probably at the most 6 millimeters at the heel. But watch how he strikes the ground in the upper left. This is him in his first interval. Oh, it's not that good. There he goes. Let's break it up. Let's see if I can do it the other one. Hold on. How's this one look? Okay, you can't really see it. That was collected with my iPhone, by the way. And at 240 hertz on an iPhone, it's amazing. So if you can see it slow motion, you want to see it. But what happened was his first interval, he was running 4-foot striking. And after my first fast interval, he transitioned his foot strike to a rear foot strike. And if you're like me, you go, because it was the coolest thing I've ever seen. Because in my world, that doesn't happen very often. But what does happen is if we went longer in a race, we see that if people start off 4-foot striking, they tend to go to rear foot striking minimalist, or when they get fatigued. So I asked him, I said, what happened afterwards? He goes, my calves were hurting, so I did it consciously. So my caveat to you is, this can be a conscious choice early on, and you can change your foot strike pattern to show improvement without changing your footwear. But if you're like me, it starts with the footwear, then it goes to your foot strike pattern, and then it goes to your gait mechanics, and then you feel good about yourself. Yeah? No? We'll skip that, and those are the references for you that I used. Okay? You guys have any questions? You want to talk about footwear, shoes? Talk about barefoot? Yeah, go ahead.
Was there a difference in running pace? Because you said for minimalist, mechanics of minimalist runner, you usually take greater frequency with less, a shorter stride. So if the same people are taking, or different people are taking the same amount of strides, but one was getting further because of longer strides, that factor, like the sprinter, would that kind of mechanics of running not really work for a sprinter if they're trying to go as quickly as possible?
So we know in sprinting you want to be a 4-foot striker. Sprinting, the most efficient way to run in sprinting is not to have your heel strike the ground, right? And one of the things with that is you're loading your structure properly. So you're storing energy in your tendons and ligaments that are going to help return. And that's part of a stiffness model in the lower extremity that we use with running. We do know about speed changes, that speed does affect gait mechanics, okay? So when you increase your velocity, traditionally people increase their stride frequency first, and then they increase their stride length first, and then they increase stride frequency. We have what we consider a natural frequency that we like to run in. So changes will happen in stride length first, and then stride frequency at the higher velocities. But changing footwear and foot strike pattern shouldn't affect that. What it will affect, shouldn't affect the velocity. What it will affect is your relationship of the stride frequency, stride length at that velocity. So if I maintain 4 meters per second with you, and I changed footwear or I changed foot strike patterns, your ratio of stride frequency to stride length to achieve that velocity will change. And a lot of that comes with how much you bound, how much you go up and down vertically. We call them gliders versus striders, or gazelles. Because we want you to bound less. We want less vertical oscillation. I know when I get knee pain, I'm running too slow because I'm bounding too much, so my knee starts to hurt. So if I'm ever running too slow, then I know I get knee pain and I have to speed up because mechanically I'm just not correct. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I'm on the track team here.
Yeah.
I'm a jumper, but I do see our distance runners, they barefoot run
So first of all, don't get me in trouble with Travis, because I'm trying to work with him and do research with him. So I'm going to be careful how I respond to that. No, I don't think anybody should always barefoot run. Even a barefoot runner, I don't think you should always do everything barefoot. Why? Because what I think is you should do everything in variation. Because this idea is overuse and overloading the system in the same pattern all the time. And the idea is loading your system differently all the time. Then you're going to avoid that overuse injury. What I do think is very important, and what it sounds like you're saying is that we all have a little bit of barefoot time in our world. And some of the soccer coaches that get it, do it. Some of the football coaches that get it, do it. And a lot of really the track athletes and the track coaches that have been doing it for decades. They got it a long time ago. And a lot of this stuff comes back to the old Oregon world and how they did things back in the day. And they're still leading a lot of it. But yeah, I wouldn't say do everything that way, no. Because you want to give that Achilles and you want to get that gastroc a little break. And by putting some stuff there, you'll be fine. That's what happened to that track athlete I did, his calf. So he hasn't been running in track for a year and a half now because he's capped out, but he still endurance runs. But for his I do a max effort 1 mile run outdoors, and that's where I establish some paces off of. He wanted to run in his spikes. So he ran a mile run in his spikes and destroyed his calf. And day 2 was a week later, so his calf was still hurt from that. But it's a gradual thing, and I'll tell you, when I did the transition, I almost snapped my Achilles. Because 3 months after I transitioned, I ran a half marathon in a very hilly course, and I wasn't ready structurally for that. And so I was limping for about a week because if I took one wrong step, I'm sure my Achilles was going. But it didn't, luckily. So I will tell you, the one thing you need to do is transition very slowly if you want to do it. And I tell people to wear minimalist shoes or barefoot in the gym all the time. It's the best place for it. Because then you're allowing your structures to build the way they should in the gym first. And before I transition anybody in barefoot or minimalist running, they do it weight training first. They do lunges, they do plyometrics, they do all that first so I can load their system in short periods and then do it from a muscular endurance perspective. But in 10 years, we'll know more about it. Because there's people like me who we truly believe in an aspect of this, but the science isn't there yet. And that's why you didn't see a lot of data. The science isn't there yet because we do things acutely, and so it's a struggle. Okay? Who's ready to go run barefoot with me? No? It's fun. I don't do barefoot. I do minimalist. Different. Cool. All right. I think they're good. They're tapping. Oh, you got another question? Oh.
Is there a difference in energy cost between running with your decker heel compared to your forefoot running?
So what we do know is if I took a traditional rear foot striker and I had them run forefoot, they would cost them more acutely. If I allow that person rear foot to train forefoot and come back in, they run it the same as they did rear foot striking. So the idea is this: do we measure people with acute changes? The idea would be no. If we truly want to see the effect of that style of running on people, we need to allow them to adapt and let their system adapt. So we know if I just have, even if I had forefoot strikers that were habitual come in and do rear foot striking, they increase their oxygen consumption at the same velocity. So it works both ways. But we know the longer they run at that pattern, they can get used to it and their oxygen consumption comes down. So they become more efficient at that. Yeah, good question. But it goes to the argument of why we're doing things in such a short period of time. And we need to allow people to adapt over it. Anybody else? Thanks, guys.